to influence their better judgment? Are you suggesting that there is this left liberal, in a way, over many of these institutes that judge India through the prism of the fact that Narendra Modi, a right-wing nationalist populist leader, is leading India, and thereby tend to, in a way, look at India through the prism of as the Prime Minister of India?
In a word, no.
In a word, no.
In a word, no. The biased organizations that are out to get India, they evaluate democracy in 150 plus countries. Most of the people involved have no particular interest in India. The problem is that all of these rankings surveys, so each of them has the same methodology. They do a survey of intellectuals, journalists, academics who either are based in the country they're studying or who are students of the country from outside. Prominent academics and journalists who cover, in India's case, India. Maybe people at Harvard, maybe people at JNU, it may be people in the mainstream media. They survey them and they ask them to report back on the country. And because, forgive me, India's intellectual class is anti-India. As a class, not as individuals.
No. India's intellectual class is anti-India, or are you saying that they are anti-Mr. Modi and are conflating the two? Or are you conflating the two?
There is a bit of both. They're certainly anti-BJP, anti-Mr. Modi. As a class, not every individual. Comparative sociologist, so my work is on international rankings, not on India as such. I've become interested in India because when you look at India in international perspective, in a comparative perspective, India is by far the world's greatest democratic success story. And I say that unreservedly because as a social scientist, if we study democracy, the first thing we see is that there are no poor democracies. There is no country with a GDP per capita of less than $10,000 per year that has a consistent record of democratic elections going back more than a few decades. India stands out as the enormous exception. It's no surprise that rich countries are democracies. All the rich countries are democracies. India is the only poor country that has a well-institutionalized democracy. It's the only post-colonial country to have remained a democracy throughout its entire history, and it's the only well-institutionalized democracy on the Eurasian continent between South Korea and Israel. That makes India a truly exceptional case that drove me to study it.
That's interesting because, you cite the fact that the GDP or the per capita income of Uttar Pradesh is very similar to that of Rwanda. And you ask us to contrast, look at democracy in Rwanda and look at it in Uttar Pradesh. So your basic thesis comes from the fact that a poor country, in your view, is one with, it's an exception, which India is an exception, a poor country, which is a rich democracy.
Statistically, it stands out. And I am a sociologist. My background, though, is as a statistician. Those of you who are engineers, I know engineers are very popular in India, will be surprised to learn I have a Master of Science in Engineering from Johns Hopkins, but it's in applied math. So I can't actually build something. Yes, we have to control for factors like wealth. We have communal, I've read a lot about communal tensions in Uttar Pradesh, Rwanda, I've heard a lot, or in Burundi, countries that have similar levels of GDP per capita as Uttar Pradesh, and it's shocking. Compare Bihar to Democratic Republic of the Congo. The Congo is the heart of darkness. It is the archetype of the basket case of a failed state. Well, Bihar has problems. I've read about them. I've never been there. I'd love to learn more about it, but nothing on the scale of the problems in the Congo. And I think that's a testament to the success of India.
Let's then test the empirical evidence that you have suggested is the basis, which you've in a way demolished or attempted to demolish, the empirical evidence cited by these think tanks that have lowered India's democracy rankings. The Economist Intelligence Unit labels India as a flawed democracy characterized by a serious deterioration in the quality of democracy under leader Narendra Modi. Sweden's VDEM says that we are essentially moving towards an electoral autocracy on par with Russia, and Freedom House says we are only partially free with an overall freedom rank of tied 85th in the world. Now, one of the major reasons they cite for this is discrimination against minorities, and they use laws like CAA to suggest, or the abolition of Article 370 to suggest that minorities are under siege. How do you link that to the ranking system?
So let's be clear, as in people are really talking about Islam in India.
We're talking about Muslims.
Primarily about Muslims in India. Muslims are severely underrepresented in Indian politics. They're probably severely underrepresented at this conference. How many Muslim speakers are at the conclave? Probably not 15%. Now, there are reasons for that. You don't have to have overt discrimination to see that sort of figure. Muslims in general are poorer than the rest of India. How many poor people are in the audience here? Very few. So if there are lower levels of education, if there are lower levels of income, you would expect lower levels of accomplishment at the level of parliamentary seats. Now, I'm not excusing that. Okay, India should be working harder to be more inclusive for its minority populations, Muslims especially. But the rankings have pointed specifically to this number of a low level of Muslim representation. 5% of Lok Sabha is Muslim. Yet the number of Muslims in the Lok Sabha has increased between 2014 and 2019. Now, we can say it hasn't increased enough.
It's a marginal increase. We are basically
increased between 2014 and 2019. Now, we can say it hasn't increased enough.
It's a marginal increase. We are basically interestingly, in 2009, 5% of the Lok Sabha was Muslim. In 2019, it was also around 5%.
Or we could say there's been a 23% increase in the number of Muslims in Lok Sabha. Look, either way you say it, it can't be used to justify a decline in the rankings between 2014 and 2019. It can be used to justify a low ranking. And if India's ranking had been consistently low on all three of these indices for the last 20 years, I wouldn't have written the paper.
Let's therefore look interestingly at one of the other factors that is cited for India's declining democracy quotient.
Is India a fascist country today? And if you want to raise your hands, I think that's really an outrageous proposition. India has problems. Certainly journalists and activists have absolutely a role to play in calling out those problems.
Is that in this era of increasingly polarized politics, it's becoming more and more difficult to have objective rankings on democracy. Am I correct?
Maybe. Maybe you're correct. Look, what I'm suggesting is that people who may have been motivated to criticize Indian democracy because they don't like the outcome that democracy has resulted in are sliding bit by bit towards, instead of criticizing the party they don't like, to criticizing the state they don't like. And that becomes a threat for India. That's the point at which India in the future may face sanctions of the kind that Israel has long been under. India, why is India so close to Russia? One reason is that India needs that Russian veto on the Security Council. Otherwise, India will be cast in the United Nations as a fascist state. Right? The activism won't stop at India's doors. The demonization of India will continue in the international arena. And that's really what you should be worrying about. Yet all of you read the U.S. news. Many of you probably have New York Times or Wall Street Journal subscriptions. You're very aware of what's happening in the U.S. All journalists, all parliamentarians in India can name the U.S. president, probably the U.S. in India, certainly the U.S. vice president. You may be able to name the Speaker of the House. You probably know 40 or 45 U.S. states. You've visited the U.S. You have relatives in the U.S. You can form your own judgment, regardless of what Joe Biden says. The problem for India is the same is not true of American journalists, of American parliamentarians. I had the head of a think tank in Australia warn me about my India research, sending me a column in the Washington Post saying that India is a fascist country. And saying, well, should I be writing this kind of work? Am I really making a mistake here? And I rolled my eyes and I said, no, that's Rana Ayub. She writes that every month in the Washington Post. You shouldn't. But he doesn't read every column she writes. For him, this was a Washington Post columnist saying it. Right? Because that's the only data point a typical leader has. I heard in person a former national security advisor of the United States tell a story about a military coup in India during the Johnson administration. Now, there's never been a military coup in India. If he meant the emergency, that wasn't during the Johnson administration. Yet this profound misunderstanding reaches into the Oval Office. Most of you know more about the United States than the National Security Advisor of the United States knows about India. And that's the problem.